Part 2, God and the Problem of Evil. So, in Part 1, we had presented the problem, or I had presented the problem of evil as that how do you explain evil in the world? If God is all powerful or omnipotent, as we sometimes use that word, how do you explain the presence of evil in the world? If God is all powerful and is supremely good, if God is all powerful, God should have the power to defeat evil, and if God is supremely good, God should want to defeat evil. So, if there's evil in the world, how do you explain those two characteristics of God? As I said in part 1, those are traditional characteristics of God. That's where we get those from. So at the end of part 1, or during part 1, we said that the evil in the world, the theist says that the evil in the world does not come from God's causing it or producing it in some way. The evil in the world comes from bad choices that human beings make. It comes from our free will. And so that it's human choices that are responsible for evil and not God. So a poorly wired home, negligence, uh, other shortcuts and so on that we kind of know that we shouldn't do, but we do. So that's where evil comes from. So that's what the theist would say. So there's evil in the world because of human choices, not because of God. The atheist response to that is that even though God may not create the evil in the world, God certainly, given the power and his desire to defeat evil, God certainly could save us from evil. I mean, a human bystander with the power to save a burning baby in a house would do it. And if the bystander didn't, we would not call that bystander good. So the fact that God may not produce evil is still leaves God in this belief in God in trouble, because if God was observing this, God should have saved the child. So why doesn't God save the child? And so that's the atheist response. The theist response to God is if he's a bystander, should do something about the evil and doesn't. That the theist response to that is that if God intervened in all in all the evil in the world, then we human beings would become dependent on God, and our dependence would make it impossible for us to develop virtues and to become worthwhile human beings. So that God doesn't intervene, even though God is a bystander, that God does not intervene because it would make us dependent. And B.C. Johnson points out that if dependence is bad, I mean, if God's intervention would make us dependent, then it must be that dependence is bad. So we should get rid of fire departments and police departments and medical personnel and so on. Then we would be left to our own to create our own situations of virtue and so on. So what the atheist says is essentially this ad absurdum argument. If God doesn't intervene because it would make us dependent, then we should get rid of all these other things. I mean, we are dependent beings, so God should save us if God has the power and the will, trying to show that God's omnipotence and supreme goodness should imply that there would be no evil in the world. So, and this is on page 3. Page 1 at the bottom of the page, that Johnson says this, and page 4 he goes on with this, and then not on page 4, on page 2, and then on page 3. the theist says that, look, if God intervened, I mean, yes, human beings are dependent, and maybe God should help us out a little bit more, but but actually, we need, if God intervened all the time, that would destroy the laws of nature. So even though we might make a case for God intervening, because we're dependent beings and we rely on other institutions, let us say, to help us out. In fact, then if God intervened all the time, then the laws of nature would collapse. You can't have God constantly interrupting or disrupting the way that the natural world works in order to prevent evil. So, if there's an electrical shortage in the house and there's a baby that's going to burn, God prevents it by stopping the short circuit or stopping the fire, something like that. But there are literally tens of thousands of fires in the world, probably at any given time. So this would mean that there would be some huge intervention by God, and if God intervened for every evil, then I mean, the laws of nature would collapse. We wouldn't be able to throw a baseball. How would we know? Why throw a baseball and not a poison dart at someone? God would intervene to catch or stop the poison dart, but not the baseball. If earthquakes happened and God intervened, I mean, the world would not. We wouldn't be able to fly airplanes. We depend on the natural world working in a certain way, and so God doesn't intervene, not only to make it possible for us to build virtues and to not become dependent on Him. This is what the theist says, but the theist continues to say God intervenes because otherwise the natural world wouldn't work. And we need the natural world to work in order for us as human beings to achieve our goals, whatever they might be. So that's what the theist says. That and essentially this is discussed on page 3 by Johnson, where Johnson says, and this is the third paragraph, Johnson says, Johnson was talking about theists may claim that evil is a necessary byproduct of the laws of nature, and therefore it is irrational for God to interfere every time a disaster happens. Such a state of affairs would alter the whole causal order, and we would then find it impossible to predict anything and also to act in the world. And so that's the theist saying, God intervenes for this reason. Johnson, arguing for the atheist point of view here, says, yes, maybe it's true that if God intervened all the time, the causal laws of nature would collapse. But couldn't God intervene in just the larger events, that the larger bad events? Why doesn't God, stop Hitler by causing a heart attack when, Hitler is an adult, or eliminating Hitler when Hitler is a baby, and so on page 3 in this third paragraph. Johnson says, only a minor alteration in electrical equipment would have been necessary to prevent the short circuit that killed the baby from burning in the house. A very large disaster could have been avoided simply by producing in Hitler a miraculous heart attack, and no one would have known it was a miracle. To argue, and now this is Johnson arguing for the point of view of the atheist, the non-believer, to argue that continued miraculous intervention by God would be wrong is like insisting that that one should never use salt because ingesting 5 pounds of it would be fatal. No one is requesting that God interfere all of the time. He should, however, intervene to prevent especially horrible disasters. Of course, the question arises, where does one draw the line? Johnson continues and says, well, certainly the line should be drawn somewhere this side of infants burning to death. To argue that we do not know where the line should be drawn is no excuse for failing to interfere in those instances that would be called clear cases of evil. What Johnson is saying is that, we're not asking for God to intervene all the time. Just stop those really, really horrible disasters. And so Johnson says, that the theist responds to God, the Johnson's point of view, the atheist, the theist responds, well, if God intervened, where should we draw the line before there's too much intervention and the causal order is totally disrupted? And Johnson says, yes, it's likely that, where should one draw the line is a good question, but certainly one should prevent babies burning in houses. The problem here, and this is a criticism of Johnson's point of view, is that the question, where should one draw the line, is a much better question than he takes it for. The question really is, where should one draw the line? One person's suffering is another person's tolerable pain. I mean, one could say that. Of course, babies burning in houses, yes, that's bad. Bad car accidents happening, that's bad too. Well, what about, just moderate bad accidents? What about, fender benders? Maybe we could have those and not car accidents that cause horrible misery. But the question is, where does one draw the line? Do I, where does my suffering begin? Another person's, saying, Neil, that's really something that's just not a very big deal. You should get over it. You should chill out. But that question is an important one. Where does one draw the line? And one can see, I think, that you can push that line further and further in either direction. You could draw the line where you're allowing too much suffering, or you could draw the line where you're not allowing enough pain, enough suffering. And so this idea of having God intervene, and this is the atheist's challenge to the theist, this idea of having God intervene enough to prevent terrible miseries. The theist does have a good response, which is, that line is really fuzzy, and you can push it all over the place. And then eventually you get either the world collapsing because natural law has been so disrupted, or you get too much pain and suffering. So important question there. One of the other points that and it's related to this, that Johnson makes in the article from the point of view of the atheist, is that the theist says, there has to be some evil in the world to contrast it with good. I mean, we need to know the difference between good and evil. Without any evil in the world, we wouldn't know what is good. I think, frankly, that this is a really good point. Without any evil in the world, we wouldn't know what is good. We all, in our own experiences, probably recognize evil and pain and suffering by having experienced some pain and evil and suffering. And so and that allows us to judge the external world. That's good, that's bad. So we need some evil in the world, or we need evil in the world, according to the theist, to allow us to distinguish between good and bad. Without evil, we don't distinguish. We can't distinguish good and bad. And as I say, I think that is a good point. But Johnson then says to arguing for the atheist, Johnson says to in rebuttal to the theist point of view, But do we need so much evil? Look at all the evil we have. We have, you know, constant wars. We have murders all the time. Um, you know, we have slavery. We have racism. We had, Nazi Germany. And there's just, we could probably sit for much of, you know, an hour or a day and list all the evils. So Johnson is saying, yes, we may need evil to be able to distinguish from good, but couldn't we have much less evil to distinguish good? I mean, do we need that much? And Johnson says on page 3, he says, I mean, he doesn't like this idea that we need a contrast between good and evil. And he says on page 3, and it's the 1, 2, 3, it's the fourth paragraph on page 3, he says, it will, responding to the theist claim that we need evil to distinguish good, in order to distinguish good, Johnson says, it will not do to claim that evil exists as a necessary contrast to good so that we might know what good is. A very small amount of evil, such as a toothache, would allow that. It is not necessary to destroy innocent human beings. And so Johnson says, we have such great evil. Why not be able to distinguish? I mean, couldn't we use a lot less evil to distinguish good and bad? And Johnson gives this example of a toothache. So, and if you think about that, now I think that Johnson is off here. At least in this kind of example, it's not that toothaches are pleasant. I have a couple of them right now, and it's not that they're pleasant. I'm dealing with them, but it's not. But if you think of it this way, if the worst that human experience was capable of was experiencing a toothache, what kind of a being would we be? I mean, would I call up my friends and say, I've defeated a toothache? Would we shout to the universe, look at what a great being human beings are. We've defeated toothaches. I don't think so. I mean, it's if we lessen the amount of evil in the world, we also lessen or diminish our claim to be a being that has some meaning, that is a meaningful being. I mean, what kind of a being is it? How meaningful is it in a life where the worst that you experience is a toothache, or maybe you stub your toe? That's not such a great. Who cares? I mean, it's not a big deal, and so and so this idea of where we draw the line. Well, couldn't we contrast discover good with a smaller amount of evil? It means that we diminish what human beings are like, and I think that is I think that's a very important criticism of Johnson's argument here. Why do we have evil in the world? Given that God has these characteristics of supreme of omnipotence and supreme goodness, why do we have evil? Well, one of the reasons the theist will say is so we can distinguish good and evil. And if we have the possibility of good, we need the possibility of evil. And the more evil we are capable of, the more good we are capable of, and the more that we can credit to ourselves as a species, the more evil that we have. So it's the difference between being I want to say, a trivial being and a profound being. And I think at some level, given the huge amount of real evil in the world, there is something profound about us. There's something that transcends, transcends just a worldly sense of a common sense of what we are. Um, that's the way that I would respond to Johnson's sort of atheistic comeback to the theistic comeback of needing evil in the world in order to contrast with good. Um, and and uh, and then on page, and I'm skipping a bit. I mean, we hopped around in part one a bit. On page 7, I'm sorry, I have weird numberings to my pages. On page 3, right after he makes the toothache comment, B.C. Johnson says, given Johnson's, let's say, argument that we could use with a lot less evil in order to be able to distinguish what good is. Giving him that point, I'm not sure we can. Johnson says on page 3, this is the last paragraph in the page, he says, the claim could be made that God had a higher morality by which his actions are to be judged. But it is a strange higher morality which claims that what we call bad is good and what we call good is bad. The point here is that the believer, the theist, says that, yes, there is a tremendous amount of evil in the world. We grant that, but yet we still want to claim, the theist says, we still want to claim that God is all powerful and supremely good, even though there's a tremendous amount of evil in the world. So the theist then has the move of saying, well, God has a higher morality. We don't understand what God really has in store for us. God has purposes for human beings that human beings cannot understand. And when we try to understand, when human beings try to understand what God has for us, what God means for us, we get lost. We can't understand it. And I mean, as Johnson says here, theists say God has a higher morality. And I have to say, I meet this point in many discussions about the problem, God and the problem of evil, that there's so much evil in the world, and it's really hard to understand that many people do move to what Johnson says here, says that the theist says, which is God has a higher morality. God is just not understandable to human beings. What Johnson says then is that I think is very damaging, and Johnson says that if God has a higher morality, and it's so much higher that we can't understand it, then this whole idea of morality makes no sense. I mean, what's good for God is bad for us, and what's good for us is bad for God, does not meet God's purposes. So if there is such a disconnect, this is essentially what Johnson is saying, if there's such a disconnect between God's notion of good and evil and what God wants that to do for us, and our notion of good and evil and our own suffering, if there's such a disconnect, God is so far removed from human life that it makes no sense to even compare our lives or pay any attention to what God has in mind for us, because it's so distinct. It's such a different idea from what would be good or bad on a human level. And it's kind of this idea, I mean, maybe we can think about this, we've all seen science fiction movies, I'm sure, where some alien race comes to Earth and is so much superior to us, that is so technologically advanced, and we want to say perhaps morally advanced, that we have no way of understanding it, and this alien species, and so what we have to conclude then is what Johnson is saying here, which is that we have no way of understanding this alien species, and we have no way of understanding God, and so for us to adopt God's morality, self foreign to us, as ours, and use God's standards as our own, it just makes sense. God is so distant that nothing God says or has in store for us really can have any meaning for us. Um, as a as uh, as Johnson says, um, well, as Johnson says on page 4, and it's the last paragraph in this. If we end up in the position that God is so much greater than us that we just can't understand God, in other words, we can have no rational theology, and that's one of the points of this whole exercise. If we cannot have any rational theology, if God just doesn't make sense, and we can have no understanding, then God is not understandable to us. What's the point? And then, as Johnson points out in the last paragraph on page 4, the believer says, well, we just have to have faith in God. We just, we don't understand God. We just have to have faith. And so we leave rational theology. We leave rational understanding of God to non-rational or irrational theology. It's just faith. You have faith or you don't have faith. And there's nothing we can say about it that makes any sense. If you believe in God, you believe in God with no reasons particularly, but reasons aren't important for that. And if you don't believe in God, you have your own reasons for it, and never will the twain meet. Never can we meet. And that's what Johnson says. Johnson does have kind of a couple last points here. One of them in this last paragraph on page 4, is that is Johnson's criticism of this idea that we just have to have faith in God. Johnson says, look, if we had a friend who claimed to be a good person, but we only saw this friend lying and cheating and stealing and taking advantage of weaker people and treating us badly, and yet if this friend continued to say that he or she was a good person, would we believe them? Would we have faith in a friend who said that? Who said, oh yes, I'm good, and then who lied to us the next day or cheated us the next day? We would not have faith in that person's goodness. So Johnson is saying, why would we have faith in a being's claim of goodness if all we saw was misery and suffering and collapse around us? And so Johnson is saying that this faith in God, once we come to this idea that goodness and badness, God's idea of goodness and our idea of goodness are so different that we can't even relate to the concept of God. If it's that different, we just have faith. But why would you have faith in a being that was so distinct, that everything it did was that it thought was good was bad for us, and vice versa? We wouldn't have faith in that kind of a friend. Johnson then moves this on page 5 and page 6 to this idea, and I don't want to go into it. This is already a really complicated lecture here, and I don't want to gum it up any more than it has to be. But ultimately, what Johnson says is we could make a case, given our world, for equal cases for that God is good or God is evil. We have enough evidence on either side to prove either one of those points. And that we decide, or many people decide, to use the evidence to prove that God is good. Johnson says we have as much as evidence to prove that God is bad, and that God is evil. And given given the traditional concept of God and the problem of evil, let us remember the problem of evil is if God is all powerful and supremely good, how can there be evil in the world? Johnson wants to say, as opposed to the theist who is trying to make those three aspects coherent and consistent with each other, Johnson is trying to say, if there's evil in the world, then God cannot be both all powerful and supremely good. Johnson says there is evil in the world, so the traditional concept of God as being all powerful and supremely good is inconsistent. You can't have evil, certainly not the type of evil we have in the world, and maintain this idea that God is all powerful and supremely good. And that is Johnson's case. I hope this has been somewhat understandable. I've jumped around a bit. It's complicated. Um, and if you want to understand the article, you'll have to read it again. I'd like you to understand it. I'm aware that students like to finish with things. I do too. You'd like me to finish with this video. That's my piece on it. I hope this is clear. Thank you. I'll maybe see you.